Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Friedlander. I'm the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Werner, President of the European Investment Bank, to discuss climate finance, Ukraine, and the annual meetings happening this week in Washington. So thank you very much for joining. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and I'll be able to pull them up and ask them to our speaker. Dr. Hoyer, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Washington.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I think we might be able to start out by asking you just briefly to give us and our American viewers an overview of what the EIB is and does.
The EIB was founded in the Treaties of Rome. These are the founding papers of the European Economic Community, which has developed into the European Union nowadays. So we are calling ourselves also as the EU Bank. We are owned by the now 27 member states of the European Union, 27 after the loss of the United Kingdom, unfortunately. That was 28. We have a business volume of, or a balance sheet of roughly $600 billion, a little bit more. And we are financed only to 1/20th of that by cash injections of the member states, plus a contingent liability of the member states. So our main source of financing is the capital markets. So we need to go to the markets and borrow between 70 and 100 billion euros per year. This again requires that we are, in particular when it comes to scientific and technological sides of our projects, we need to be top-notch, because otherwise the investors would not entrust us their money. So to a large extent we are an engineering-driven bank, and this is why we need to also address issues like innovation, climate, health, with a lot of expertise in these fields.
Sure, thank you. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of what some of the key signature projects have been, and then maybe how you see the bank developing going forward, given those goals that you've just stated.
Well, I'll give you an example. COVID, that of course was something that nobody had on screen, with the exception of some people in the life science department of the bank who always said we need to be a well-prepared institution. And some diseases will come up. Nobody had seen COVID exactly, but something like it. Just like they now say something like antimicrobial resistance, that will come and will be probably by 2050 the most important source of death for our citizens, because antibiotics will not work anymore. So these are things that can be foreseen, predicted. But what happens with COVID, that was beyond our imagination. So we were confronted with huge challenges of the member states who were desperate. They needed support for the medical systems, their hospitals, their equipment. And at the same time, there was the need to come up with cure, diagnostics, and vaccines. And at that time, the saying was, well, the development of a new vaccine, that takes 5 years. So we were engaged in that, and like others were around the world. And our main product, the BioNTech vaccine, which is nowadays marketed by Pfizer, was developed within months. Mm-hmm. So it is amazing what can be done if there is a resolve behind it and the necessary political support.
It's a really great story. I mean, maybe, you mentioned just before we began this conversation that the crisis in Ukraine is a watershed moment, a 9/11 moment. In fact, I had the pleasure of welcoming Vice President Shevkovich sitting right where you are right now, and he said the exact same thing. How does this affect the world of finance and the world of development finance?
Very much so. It begins with Ukraine itself. Ukraine needs our full support every day from morning to night, because what these courageous people are doing there is they're fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their freedom, and they're fighting for our freedom. So this is something that is not local or regional or national. This is something that affects, and it's not only European. Mm-hmm. If we must support Ukraine in order to be successful in this terrible situation. That requires, of course, immediate action in Ukraine. We have been in Ukraine active for many, many years. And since when Russia occupied or annexed Crimea in 2014, the European Council asked us to reconsider our activities in Russia. These were quite substantial because we financed a part of the so-called Partnership for Modernization in Russia. Urgently needed, because look at the lack of competitiveness of Russian industry. They needed to do something about the competitiveness, and when we stopped that program, that was quite a blow for Russia. That, on the other hand, set means free, which we then were able to invest in the neighborhood of Russia, in particular in Ukraine. So we were present already in Ukraine when this present situation came up. But then the needs were immediately visible, and we were able to begin within a few days with the first package of $700 million dollars. And we have put up together another package very quickly of $1.5 billion. But we know much more will have to be done, in particular, if we will finally get the chance to rebuild Ukraine. Then we are talking about sums which are beyond imagination for the time being. But I'm sure that the community of nations will be ready to do that. But that's a long way to go. Right now, we already have issues where the Ukrainians, these resolved and courageous people, are beginning to repair what has been damaged, sometimes destroyed by themselves, because they for instance, destroyed bridges in order to keep the Russian tanks away from their cities, and nowadays they need these bridges back. So we already are very busy. In addition to that, we need to see the situation in the neighborhood. We have a couple of million refugees already in the neighboring countries. It's not only Poland and Moldova, it goes far into the west of Europe and to North America. And there these receiving countries need support as well, and we have just wrapped a package of 4 billion euros, so almost $5 billion for the countries which receive refugees. But as big as these sums might appear, it's only a beginning, and the consequences for the global economy are breathtaking. At the beginning, many people thought this is a European affair, until it became serious and evident that key supplies of wheat or maize to the rest of the world would stop, and hunger would return to parts of Africa and other places. We have a hunger crisis in Egypt, understandable, but it's there now, and we must help there. I'm not talking about fuels and energy. I'm just talking about food. And the world food crisis is something that demands our full attention and action. And this is why, in my capacity as chairman of the group of the 10 biggest multilateral development banks, I try to bring the MDB 10 together in order to develop a coordinated effort to stop the destruction of the fruits of decades of development work in some parts of the world. And that is unfortunately already visible.
Yeah, it's incredible that you say that in the course of months that such achievements but have been rolled back. Maybe you can explain a little bit more about how some of these funds are dispersed, right? We hear all the time, the EU has a pocket of money, the US has a pocket of money, the World Bank has a pocket of money. When we say this, and sometimes the numbers are very generous and very large, what does that mean on the ground? Where does the money go, and once it's in country, how is it dispersed?
Well, of course, like always, you need to have solid partners to make sure that the money arrives where the purpose directs it and doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So this is not easy, but there, as far as Ukraine is concerned, we have good experience. We have experience, and we have in particular good experience. Always you can criticize things. Disbursements in Ukraine, for instance, have always taken much longer than we would have expected, and this is now catching up. The government is very helpful, I must say, and but at the end of the day, if you have a big infrastructure project, it requires the necessary due diligence, otherwise you run the risk of wasting the money, and that must not happen. Much more important that the community of nations coordinates itself.
Mm-hmm. And how does that, how do you foresee that happening? I mean, which bodies or which banks, and how could that, I mean, again, we're in a crisis moment, but I think we recognize that we're at the very beginning of something that could be very, very tragic and very impactful. So what is a potential roadmap going forward once we move beyond the immediate shock?
Well, I think for the time being, most governments, or many governments in the so-called Western countries, are quite generous when it comes to direct budget support for Ukraine, and this will have to move towards more project financing relatively soon. There, the multilateral development banks have a significant role to play, because like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the climate goals of Paris, we will achieve all these objectives only by mobilizing much more private money. Public budgets will never suffice to allow us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or the climate goals. So this is where an institution like ours comes in, or other multilateral development banks, who can go to the capital markets and mobilize private capital, convince people in the markets, investors, that they're doing something serious on good technical grounds. So I think that justifies the existence and the operation of multilateral development banks, or also national promotional institutions and development agencies who can go to the capital markets, because we need both. We need the support and the backing of the shareholders and the nation states, but we also need the trust of the capital markets.
And capital markets are pretty riled by the current crisis, right? I mean, if you look at global growth projections, on supply chains, I mean, on inflation and domestic pressures on many governments, isn't it possible that capital is going to be tighter in the coming years?
It can be, but on the other hand, I happen to be a structural optimist.
Me too.
And I live on the assumption that Churchill was right: never miss a good crisis. And this is the opportunity now to address a couple of necessary, overdue changes. Mm-hmm. I mean, I talk about my own country. We have been blind not to see this energy dependency of most of the European nations from Russia and other suppliers. So now we need to wake up and do something. It's going to be a painful transition, but it needs to be done. And just take the example of Ukraine. These people are, as we see, extremely bright, and they are well educated, well trained. And when they rebuild, they will make true what some people only have in the headlines: rebuild better. They don't want to simply restore what has been destroyed. They want to build a strong economy. And from that point of view, it's also an opportunity, but it's unbelievable that it takes so many sacrifices, so many victims to arrive at this recognition. We are now doing things that we should have done decades ago.
Yeah, I agree. And things can, sometimes things move very slowly and then things move very fast, including in your home country being obviously Germany. What do you think of the European Commission's ambitions to reduce the bloc's dependency on Russian fossil fuels by 2/3 in a very short period of time?
It's difficult for me to quantify that, but I tend to adopt a can-do approach. We have, of course, vested interests in our economies and industries who would like to perpetuate the situation the way it is and rely upon Russian fuels. This cannot be the line to take. I think we need to recognize we need to go through painful processes, but we need to do it now. Whether the quantitative breakdown done by the European Commission here is correct or not, this is something I cannot judge. But I think it is good that the European Union, the Commission representing the European Union, pushes us on this. We need to take up speed. Right now, I mean, we are in the favorable situation. There's this terrible situation now becomes particularly acute when we move into spring and summer. So let's not waste the next 6-8 months in order to begin these structural changes right now.
And how can the EIB help with that?
Well, obviously the move to other energy sources, to other technologies requires huge investment. And that's when multilateral development banks or also national development banks come in. I think the money is lying on the street for that. Mobilizing private capital is possible. We need to come up with good projects, and this is why those national or multilateral institutions who have a strong science and engineering base are in a relatively good position.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one risk here is that in the short term, getting away from Russian oil and gas means more oil from and others from elsewhere. And so I guess it's the balance and how quickly that transition can be from Russian fossil fuels to renewables, in that sense, leapfrogging and sort of accelerating the process that you say was, lying in wait, as you just referenced.
We are always underestimating the potential reform activities. Look at what people would have said 20 years ago about wind and solar power. They would have said too expensive, not efficient enough. Nowadays, in most countries of the European Union at least, solar and wind power is cheaper than anything you can do with fossil fuels. Now we move into the next generation of, for instance, of wind power. At the beginning, people were surprised to see these asparagus towers in the countryside producing energy at relatively high prices, or having solar panels on house roofs. Then the next step was to say, okay, let's not do it on land, let's do it offshore. And then people were complaining that the beautiful coasts of Europe or America would be destroyed by the optical impression of wind power 10 miles off the coast. Now we are moving into completely new technologies with floating wind farms, which have a huge energy effect and efficiency. And they are going to be one of the key power sources of the future. We are moving much more into geothermal activities. Solar is not exploited at all, in my view. And take for instance this mega example of hydrogen. Everybody is dreaming of hydrogen, but if you take dirty hydrogen, you have the same CO2 effects you have with other sources. You need to produce green hydrogen. How do you do that? Well, you need enormous amounts of electrolysis capacity in order to turn hydrogen into green hydrogen, and it is possible today. It is possible, and it's becoming more and more economically viable. So let's courageously concentrate on that. And by that, by the way, also answers the question of the future of development policy. We need to bring the best, most actual technologies to partner countries, for instance, in Africa. Everybody is talking about the relationship between Europe and Africa. Yeah, we need to bring reality to that. I think one day we will have the sources for our hydrogen needs in the electrolysis capacities in Africa. This, however, requires that beyond the population growth induced energy needs in Africa, we need to make sure that within the next 50 to 20 years, the electricity production in Africa grows by the factor 4. So you can put a couple of Chinese coal power plants there, and the sustainable development goals go up in smoke. Or you do it with the latest technologies, including the one I've mentioned for electrolysis, and then we have a huge partnership base for our relationship with Africa. So let's think big.
And you think that Western capital will be competitive with Chinese bids? I mean, we discuss this in the development context all the time, and even in global competition, right? The race to the bottom on procurement.
Yeah, the race to the bottom, that's of course a problem. So clear standards there are necessary, and we need also to convince our partners, for instance in Africa, but in other places in the world as well, that our procurement standards, for instance, are not bureaucratic nonsense, but there is a good reason behind it. But I see wherever I go in Latin America or in Africa or in parts of Asia, how active China is and how much we seem to lose the competition. But on the other hand, I sometimes see projects where you have, I don't mention the location, a huge freeway, 10 meters up, connecting an airport with the downtown area of a big city. And this project is so expensive and needs to be toll-based that nobody will be able to pay these tolls except for the very rich in that country. Mm-hmm. And the rest, 90%, will still drive through the mud underneath. At the end of the day, you have a huge sustainability problem for that country's budget, because these debts will remain on the budget for the next decades. Mm-hmm. So we need to also present, when we make an offer, the whole picture and say sustainability is something that is not only a principle that we adhere to, but also a principle that is very, very healthy for your own economy and your own budgets. So we need to get better in offering our assistance and our products and our cooperation. And we need to get away from this donor-recipient thinking and establish real partnerships with Latin America, with Africa and Asia.
That's ambitious. I understand that is the stated goal of EIB Global, right? Sort of broadening out beyond the European continent. We're coming up to the end here, but I wanted to just sort of offer the opportunity for you to say anything else again about the role that MDBs play, the role that Washington should play, anything that the institutions in the U.S. government might be able to help with. I mean, we're sitting just a couple blocks from the White House.
Well, there again, I'm quite optimistic. I've been involved in American politics, or at least pretty close to it, for all my life, and we presently have a very favorable situation. I'm looking forward to meeting John Kerry these days here, and others, and I'm sure that we can really join forces again. For many years we have been drifting apart too much. That is not good for the United States. That's definitely not good for Europe. So now we have again found a solid base, and I'm optimistic that we can exploit that by aligning our policies, but also by financing our next adventures in technical progress, in innovation, and in the link between innovation, climate, and development.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoyer.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us at the Atlantic Council for a very much marathon IMF week. And we look to see what comes out of the meetings in the coming days. Thank you very much.